Okay, so whenever we are holding our instrument, it doesn't matter if it's an assessment instrument or a curette. Our grasp is very important. So remember, we have our thumb and our index finger on the handle near the shank with a space between it that's going to allow us to roll. Remember, we roll with our thumb and our index finger. That middle finger is coming on the handle and the shank because this is where the vibrations will transfer through the shank so that we can pick up any irregularities or anomalies on the tooth surface, such as calculus or an overhanging margin. And then the ring finger is the fulcrum finger where we're going to rest. So we've talked about this in lab already. If I needed to pivot on my fulcrum, that means that I am placing my ring finger on a tooth, and I can get tall on my fulcrum, which means I'm bringing my hand up and I'm bending at the wrist to get tall. I'm pivoting on my fulcrum. This is really important if I am working on a tooth and I need to, if I'm working and I have my tooth, posterior tooth, and I'm using a curette and I'm coming across that wide span of that tooth, and as I'm walking my instrument, and now I'm going to be using a wrist forearm action. Wrist forearm action is the hand in the wrist, the lower arm is working in one motion. I call it a princess wave. The book talks about like turning a doorknob, but what it means, it's very different than digital. Digital, the fingers flexing back and forth. Wrist forearm is simply this. Now remember, we're on a tooth and it's a very small surface, so our gestures are not going to be this big. Our gesture on a tooth might be very micro wrist forearm action. So in order to move this instrument across the tooth, when I place it, and we'll talk about how we open and close a little bit later, but when I place this instrument, I need to, in order to walk it across from the distal to the mesial, I need to do wrist forearm action, and I am going to be pivoting at the same time. And you'll see that my hand is coming up slightly so that I can get my working end and my lower shank adapted to that mesial surface. So I started in a horizontal position. I am doing my wrist forearm action ever so slightly. I am actively rolling. My thumb is actually coming towards me so I can roll that working end towards that line angle. And then I get tall on my fulcrum so I can bring that lower shank parallel to that tooth so that I know I'm adapted into proximately. So there's a lot of steps that we're doing with that hand now. So we have our grasp. We have to have that space so that we can roll. We have to practice the wrist forearm action. We can certainly do the digital action when we're exploring. You know, the fingers are going back and forth depending upon what we're doing. But even if I had an 1112 Explorer, you can sometimes do digital, but you're often going to be doing wrist forearm action across that tooth so that you can feel. You can do those multi-direction strokes. You can be oblique, you could be vertical, you could be horizontal. And how do you get to be oblique, vertical, and horizontal? We'll go into that a little bit more. It's all about the pivoting on the fulcrum that's going to allow that working end to go in the direction that you want it to go. Right now I pivoted down. My handle is getting fairly parallel to that occlusal plane, which means my working end is laying down. It is parallel to that tooth. But when I go oblique, I'm pivoting, and you can see what's happening to my working end. And when I get into proximately, that lower shank's parallel, I went from being fulcrum down here to getting tall on my fulcrum to bring it up. So we are walking wrist forearm, we are rolling to get around a line angle, and we're getting tall so we can get that shank parallel. Now, when we adapt an instrument to a tooth, even though the working end could be anywhere from 5 to 10 millimeters in length, we're only really adapting with the 1 to 2 first millimeters of the lateral side of an instrument. That's really all that's in contact. It's equivalent to using our fingertips to feel something, to feel if something is smooth, if a surface is smooth. We very rarely take our whole hand and all of our fingers and our entire hand to feel a surface. We use our fingertips. So the 1 to 2 millimeters of the lateral side of an instrument is equivalent to your fingertips.